The man on the porch was not what My Lin had expected. She had been told by the freight driver that a rancher was coming, a man named Arthur Pendleton looking for work. She had imagined someone loud and broad, a man who would fill the doorway with swagger and smell of cheap whiskey. But the man standing before her was quiet, his shoulders slightly stooped as if from a burden he'd carried too long. It was his dog that made the first real impression. A big, golden-coated retriever, the kind of animal that should have been bounding with confidence, was pressed so tightly against the man's leg it seemed to be trying to merge with his trousers. It was hiding. My Lin's hands did not relax their grip on the Winchester rifle she held. Its wooden stock was cool and solid against her shoulder. "I was told you need a rancher," Arthur Pendleton said. His voice was low, roughened by dust and disuse. "I need help," she corrected, her voice clear and steady. She did not lower the rifle. In the 3 months since her husband Chen's death, she had learned that a lone woman, especially a Chinese woman holding a deed to 160 acres of prime grazing land with its own creek, was a magnet for trouble. The town of Jericho Springs tolerated her existence, but it did not welcome it. Every stranger was a potential threat. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. This here is Gus." He gave a slight nod toward the trembling dog. "He's not much for introductions." My Lin's gaze swept over him. He was weathered, not old, but worn down by sun and worry. His clothes were clean but patched, his boots scuffed nearly through at the toes. He looked like a man who had lost something. She knew the look well, she saw it in her own reflection in the window glass each morning. Still, trust was a currency she no longer possessed. "Why here?" she asked, the question blunt. "Plenty of ranches bigger than this one looking for hands. Ranches run by white men." A flicker of something, shame, perhaps, crossed his face before it settled back into a mask of weary resolve. "Those ranches aren't hiring me. Lost my own spread up in Montana. Drought, then debt." Word follows a man. He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly for the first time. They were a pale, washed-out blue, but steady. "I don't need a big wage. Just a bunk and meals. I'm a good worker. I know cattle, I know fences, and I know how to be quiet." The last part registered with her. The silence in the small clapboard house had become a living thing since Chen was gone, a constant, humming presence. The thought of filling it with the boisterous noise of a typical ranch hand was unbearable. This man, with his quiet voice and his frightened dog, seemed different. But different was not the same as safe. "I don't know you, Mr. Pendleton." "No, you don't," he agreed. "So let me make a proposition. Give me 1 week. No pay. Just food for me and the dog, and a place to sleep in the barn. If at the end of that week you don't think my work is worth what I'm asking, I'll move on. No trouble." It was a fair offer. A desperate one. She studied him again, her eyes narrowing. The rifle felt heavier in her hands. The northern fence line was down in 2 places, the well pump was starting to stick, and a sickness had taken 2 of her calves last week. She couldn't do it all alone, not with winter coming. Bartholomew Finch, the man who owned the vast territory to her east, had already sent a man by to make a low offer on her land, an offer that was more of a veiled threat. She knew that showing weakness was an invitation for him to press harder. Hiring a hand, any hand, was a sign she intended to stay. "The bunkhouse is out back," she said, finally lowering the Winchester, though she did not put it down. "It's small. Just a cot and a stove." "It'll do," Arthur said. A wave of relief seemed to pass through him, so profound his shoulders straightened just a fraction. "There are rules," she continued, her tone sharp. "No liquor. No visitors. You do the work I set for you, and you keep to your own space. I run this ranch. You work for me. Is that understood?" "Yes," he said. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Understood." He turned, and the dog, Gus, stayed glued to his leg as they walked toward the small, weathered bunkhouse. My Lin watched them go, the rifle now resting in the crook of her arm. She felt a knot of apprehension in her stomach. She had just let a stranger onto her land, a man whose own history was one of failure. She didn't know then that his past was not the danger she should have been watching for. The real danger had been circling her property for months, just waiting for the right moment to strike. The first 4 days passed in a haze of work and watchful silence. Arthur Pendleton was true to his word. He rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set. He didn't just mend the northern fence, he resunk the posts and stretched the wire taut, making it stronger than it had ever been. He disassembled the well pump, cleaned out the grit that was choking it, and reassembled it with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, never wasting a step or a swing of the hammer. He spoke only when necessary, to ask where she kept the spare wire or if she wanted the new calves moved to the lower pasture. Mylin watched him from the porch, from the kitchen window, from the barn loft. She saw the way he checked the cattle for ticks, his hands gentle and sure. She saw him talking to his dog in a low murmur when he thought no one was listening, the words a soft comfort that slowly began to coax the animal out of its shell. By the 3rd day, Gus would venture a few feet away from Arthur's side to lie in a patch of sun, though his eyes never left his master. On the 5th day, the crisis arrived. It came not as a loud threat, but as a slow, insidious dwindling. The creek, the lifeblood of her ranch that cut through the western pasture, was running low. It was summer, and the heat had been relentless, but this was more than just evaporation. The flow was weak, the water level dropping by the hour. Arthur noticed it first. He came to the house in the late afternoon, his hat in his hands, a deep line of concern etched between his brows. Someone's dammed the creek upstream. Mylin felt a cold dread spread through her. Upstream was Bartholomew Finch's land. "Are you sure?" "I followed it a half-mile past your property line," he said. "Fresh earthwork. A new diversion ditch. They're channeling the water to his own reservoir." This was it. The attack she had been waiting for. It wasn't with guns or fists, but with shovels and dirt. Without the creek, her pastures would turn to dust in a week. Her cattle would have to be sold for pennies on the dollar. She would be starved out. "Get your horse," she said, her voice tight. She went inside and retrieved the Winchester, checking the load. "Maybe I should go alone," Arthur suggested, his gaze fixed on the rifle. A man like Finch, he might not take kindly to being confronted. "This is my land, Mr. Pendleton," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "My water. I will not send a hired hand to fight my battles." They rode out together, the silence between them thick with tension. When they reached the new dam, they found Finch himself, sitting on his fine horse, overseeing 3 of his men. He was a portly man, dressed in a clean suit despite the heat, a picture of smug authority. He smiled when he saw them approach, a wide, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Chen," he said, tipping his hat with a theatrical flourish. He ignored Arthur completely. "A pleasure to see you out enjoying the afternoon." "You're stealing my water, Finch," Mylin said, keeping her horse a careful distance away. Finch feigned surprise. "My dear lady, I assure you, I am merely making improvements to my own property. This is my land, and therefore, my water." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket. "My deed is quite clear on the matter. My property line extends to the far bank of this tributary." "That's a lie," Mylin stated, her voice ringing with cold fury. "The survey filed with the territorial office marks the creek as the boundary. The water rights are shared." "An unfortunate misunderstanding, I'm sure," Finch said, his politeness a suffocating blanket. "But my paperwork says otherwise." "I'm afraid you are mistaken." His men had stopped working, leaning on their shovels, their expressions a mixture of amusement and menace. It was 3 against 1, and Arthur was unarmed. Mylin was suddenly aware of how exposed they were. But then Arthur spoke, his voice quiet but carrying in the still air. "That deed you're holding, Mr. Finch. The signature. Is that County Recorder John Webb's mark?" Finch's eyes snapped to Arthur. The smile on his face tightened. It is. All perfectly legal and binding. Funny, Arthur said, his gaze steady. I knew John Webb, back when I had my place. He had a tremor in his right hand. His signature was always shaky. That one, from here, it looks as smooth as a river stone. The air crackled. Finch's mask of civility slipped. His face hardened, the politeness replaced by a cold fury. He had not expected this quiet, worn-down man to speak at all, let alone with such a pointed observation. His men shifted their weight, their hands moving closer to the pistols on their hips. Mai Lin seized the moment. She had her own copy of Chen's deed and the official survey map folded in her saddle bag. She knew her ground. The U.S. Marshal might be interested in Mr. Webb's remarkably steady hand, and in your interpretation of territorial water law, Mr. Finch. Finch stared at them, his mind clearly racing. He had expected a frightened widow, easily intimidated. He had not anticipated her resolve, nor the unexpected complication of a man who paid attention to details like a man's signature. A public accusation of forgery, even without immediate proof, was a messy business. He finally let out a short, harsh laugh. There's no need for such unpleasantness. Perhaps there has been a mistake in the survey. I'll have my men look into it. He gave a sharp nod to his workers. Tear it down. For now. He wheeled his horse around and rode off without another word, his back rigid with anger. His men, sullen and silent, began to dismantle the dam. As Mai Lin and Arthur rode back to the ranch, the creek already beginning to swell behind them, a new understanding had formed. He had stood with her. He hadn't been intimidated. He had noticed something she had missed, a detail that had turned the tide. The balance of power on the small ranch had shifted. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Bartholomew Finch was not a man who gave up. He had simply changed his tactics. The next time he came, it would not be with deeds and polite words. That evening, a different kind of silence filled the small kitchen. It wasn't the empty, grieving silence Mai Lin was used to, nor the wary, watchful silence of the past week. It was a silence of assessment of a shared danger survived. She had insisted Arthur eat at her table, not in the bunkhouse. He had washed up at the basin on the porch, his face and hands scrubbed clean, but the weariness still clung to him like a second skin. He ate slowly, methodically, as if he were measuring out his energy. Gus, for the first time, was not hiding. The dog lay on the floor near Arthur's chair, his head on his paws, his tail giving a soft, rhythmic thump against the wooden planks. Thank you, Mai Lin said, the words feeling inadequate. For what you did today. Arthur looked up from his plate, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. He would have ruined you, it wasn't a question. He's been trying to buy this land since Chen died, she admitted, the confession costing her a measure of her carefully guarded pride. The offers get lower every time. It's the water, Arthur said. His land is good, but yours is better because of this creek. He controls the water, he controls the whole valley. She nodded, pushing a stray grain of rice around her bowl with a chopstick. The instinct to keep her fears locked away was strong, but the events of the day had breached those walls. My husband? Chen, he knew Finch was a dangerous man. He told me so. She rose from the table and went to a small, carved wooden box on the mantel. From it, she removed a letter, the paper softened and creased from countless readings. She handed it to Arthur. He wrote this 2 days before the accident, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. He was trampled by a spooked horse, they said. Out on the range. Arthur took the letter carefully. The script was elegant, a mix of English words and Chinese characters. He read the English part slowly. It was a letter of love and of warning. Chen wrote of his suspicions about Finch, about his attempts to intimidate other homesteaders. And then, one line stood out. He does not know I have the ledger. I keep it safe. If anything happens to me, it is the only proof. Arthur looked up, a question in his eyes. The ledger? I don't know, Mai Lin confessed, the admission a painful one. "I've looked everywhere. In the house, the barn, his saddlebags. I turned this place inside out. It's gone. Without it, his words are just suspicions." The truth settled between them, heavy and cold. Chen's death was no accident. They both knew it now, with a certainty that went beyond suspicion. Finch hadn't just wanted the land, he had killed for it. And now, they had publicly defied him. They had shown him they would not be easily broken. The realization of their shared peril hung in the air. Arthur folded the letter and handed it back to her. His calloused fingers brushed against hers, a brief, solid touch. "He'll be back," Arthur said. It was not a prediction, it was a promise. The attack came 3 nights later. There was no warning, just the sudden, terrified lowing of cattle, a sound of pure panic that ripped through the quiet of the night. Arthur was out of the bunkhouse in an instant, pulling on his boots as he ran. Mai Lin met him on the porch, the Winchester already in her hands. In the moonlight, they could see them, 2 riders, their faces obscured by bandanas, galloping along the fence line, firing pistols into the air. The small herd, about 30 head, was stampeding, their eyes wide with terror, charging blindly toward the weakened southern fence that bordered a steep, rocky ravine. "They're trying to drive them over the edge," Arthur yelled over the din. "It's not just a scare tactic. They mean to destroy your herd." There was no time for a plan. Mai Lin ran for the corral, her mind racing. Arthur was already sprinting toward the stampede, waving his arms, trying to turn the lead steer. It was a fool's errand for a man on foot. "My horse," she shouted, saddling her mare with frantic, practiced hands. She rode out of the corral at a gallop, the rifle held tight against her side. She raced to get ahead of the herd, placing herself between the terrified animals and the ravine. She fired a shot into the air, away from the riders, the blast echoing in the narrow valley. The lead animals shied, turning slightly. Arthur had managed to get one of the fence gates open, creating an escape route into the safer eastern pasture. He stood in the gap, a lone figure against a tide of panicked beef, shouting, waving, trying to channel the chaos. One of Finch's men saw him. The rider wheeled his horse, raising his pistol, the muzzle flashing in the dark. Mai Lin didn't think. She raised the Winchester, sighted down the barrel, and fired. She didn't aim for the man, but for the ground in front of his horse. The dirt kicked up in a spray, and the horse screamed, rearing violently. The rider, caught off guard, was thrown hard. The other man, seeing his partner down and the cattle turning, decided he had done enough damage. He fired one last shot in their direction before galloping off into the darkness. The stampede had broken. The cattle, their momentum blunted, flowed through the open gate into the pasture, their panicked bellows slowly quieting. The immediate danger was over. Mai Lin rode over to where Arthur was kneeling beside the thrown rider. The man was groaning, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Arthur had already removed his pistol. "He'll live," Arthur said, his voice grim. "Broken leg, most likely." Mai Lin looked from the groaning man on the ground to the dark expanse where the other had fled. They had won the moment, but the war was far from over. Finch now knew they would fight back. He had underestimated them both. As Arthur stood up, he winced, pressing a hand to his side. In the moonlight, Mai Lin saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt, a long, shallow gash from a stray bullet. They had not come away unscathed. 6 months later, the first snows of winter were dusting the high peaks, and the air in the valley had a clean, sharp bite. The ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the peaceful hum of a place that was secure, a place that was thriving. The fences all stood straight and strong. A new, sturdy-looking well house had been built over the pump Arthur had fixed, insurance against any future droughts or creek diversions. The herd, 32 head strong now after a few new births, grazed peacefully in the autumn sun. Inside the main house, a fire crackled in the hearth. The ledger Chen had written about sat on the mantel, its leather cover worn. They had found it 2 days after the stampede. While clearing the debris in the barn, Arthur's boot had gone through a loose floorboard near the back wall. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was the book. Its pages were filled with Chen's neat script, detailing every underhanded deal, every threat, every forged document Bartholomew Finch had used to build his empire. They had taken it to the U.S. Marshal in the territorial capital, a 2-day ride. The throne rider, once his leg was set, had been more than willing to testify against Finch in exchange for a lighter sentence. Finch was arrested, his reign of intimidation over. The news had traveled through Jericho Springs like a wildfire, and the looks My Lin got in town were no longer ones of suspicion or pity, but of a grudging, hard-won respect. Arthur Pendleton no longer slept in the bunkhouse. He had a room in the main house now. The arrangement was unspoken, undefined, but it was solid. A partnership? He had never asked for a wage beyond his keep, and she had never offered one. Instead, she had taken him to the land office and had his name officially added to the deed as a co-owner of the homestead. They sat on the porch, as they often did in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Gus, the dog who had arrived trembling with fear, lay stretched out between them. He nudged his head under Arthur's hand for a scratch, then rested his chin on My Lin's knee, his tail thumping a contented rhythm against the porch boards. Arthur had finally told her about his place in Montana. He hadn't just lost it to drought, he'd been cheated by a man just like Finch, a man with a forged deed and the power to make it stick. He had come to her ranch a defeated man. But here, he had found something he thought he had lost forever, a reason to stand his ground. "Good fences," he said, his voice a low rumble, breaking the comfortable silence. His gaze was on the neat lines of post and wire that defined their land. My Lin looked at the fences, then at the man beside her. She thought of the walls she had built around herself after Chen's death, fences of fear and distrust. They were gone now, replaced by something stronger. "Good neighbors," she replied softly. It was all that needed to be said. They had built more than a ranch. Out of loneliness and desperation, out of shared danger and quiet courage, they had built a home. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.